The idea that reality depends on mind or ideas is the heart of idealism. In simple terms, idealism says that what we call the world is not a set of things that exist on their own. Instead, the world is made of thoughts, feelings, or ideas that live in a mind. If there is no mind, the world would not be there in the way we think it is. This claim can sound strange, but it has been part of human thought for a very long time. The earliest roots of idealism can be found in ancient stories and teachings. In ancient Greece, a man named Plato talked about a world of perfect ideas. He called these ideas, according to Plato, the things we see around us are only copies of these perfect forms. He wrote, "The visible world is but a shadow of the true world." In his view, the true reality is the realm of forms, which exists in the mind of the divine or the soul. This view already hints that the material world is not the ultimate reality. A similar line of thought appears in early Indian philosophy. The Upanishads, a collection of ancient Indian texts, speak of a single underlying reality called Brahman. One verse says, "All is Brahman, and Brahman is all." In this view, the many objects we see are expressions of one single mind, like reality. The Upanishadic sages taught that when a person sees the world as a set of separate things, they miss the deeper truth that everything is part of one mind. These ancient ideas set the stage for later philosophers who would argue that mind is the source of everything we call real. One of the most famous modern idealists was George Berkeley, an 18th century Irish thinker. Berkeley said, "To be is to be perceived." He meant that objects exist only when a mind sees them. If nobody looks at a tree, the tree does not cease to be a tree, but its existence is still tied to the fact that a mind, either a human mind or God's mind, perceives it. Berkeley's famous phrase captures the core claim of idealism in a very plain way. To see how this claim works in everyday life, consider a vivid dream. While a person is dreaming, the dream feels real. The colors, sounds, and feelings all seem solid. The dreamer can be scared, happy, or confused, just as in waking life. When the dream ends, the dream world disappears, but while it lasted, the mind created a whole reality. This shows how a mind can generate a world that feels as real as the waking world. A second, everyday example is a movie. When a person watches a film, the screen shows people, places, and events that are not actually there. Yet the viewer can feel excitement, fear, or sadness as if the events were happening. The story on the screen can move the heart and change the mood. In that moment, the mind treats the fictional world as if it were real. The film world exists only in the light on the screen and in the thoughts of the audience, yet it has a powerful effect. These examples help to illustrate the basic idea of idealism, that a mind can create a reality that feels solid and lasting. However, many people have simple objections to this claim. The first objection is that the world feels solid and permanent. When a person touches a rock, the rock does not seem to change. It stays there even when no one is looking at it. This feeling makes people think that the rock must exist on its own, independent of any mind. A second objection is that the world seems to follow rules that do not depend on thoughts. For example, the law of gravity pulls objects down whether anyone is watching. A ball will fall to the ground even in an empty room. This regularity suggests that the world has its own order, separate from any mind. Idealists have responses to these objections. To the first objection, they point out that the feeling of solidity comes from the mind's interpretation of sensory data. The rock feels solid because the brain organizes the data into a stable picture. If the brain were wired differently, the rock might feel different. The rock's solidity is a mental construction, not a property that exists on its own. To the second objection, idealists argue that the rules we observe are part of the structure of the mind's ideas. The law of gravity, for instance, is a pattern that the mind recognizes and uses to predict what will happen. The pattern exists in the mind as a rule that helps the mind make sense of experience. In this view, the regularities of nature are not independent laws, but the mind's way of organizing experience. Historical anecdotes can make these ideas clearer. One story tells how Plato's student, Aristotle, once asked his teacher why the shadows on a cave wall seemed real to the prisoners inside. Plato used this story, called the allegory of the cave, to show that people often mistake appearances for true reality. The prisoners see only shadows and think that those shadows are all that exists. When a prisoner is freed and sees the world outside the cave, he realizes that the shadows were just copies of real objects. This tale illustrates the idealist view that what we see is only a shadow of deeper ideas. Another anecdote comes from ancient India. The sage Yajnavalkya once debated a group of skeptics who claimed that nothing could be known for certain. Yajnavalkya answered by saying that the self, the I, is the only thing that can be known directly. He taught that the self is pure consciousness, and all objects are reflections of that consciousness. This story shows how early Indian thinkers linked reality to the mind and how they saw the world as a projection of consciousness. Real-world applications of idealism can be found in modern technology. Virtual reality, VR, creates a computer-generated world that users can see and hear. When a person puts on a VR headset, the brain treats the virtual environment as if it were real. The mind's ability to accept the virtual world shows that perception can be shaped by ideas alone. Idealist ideas help explain why VR can feel so convincing. Another application appears in the field of cognitive therapy. Therapists help people change the way they think about their problems. By altering the ideas in a person's mind, the therapist can change the person's emotional experience of the world. This practice works because the mind's ideas shape the sense of reality. If the mind believes that a situation is threatening, the person feels fear. If the mind changes that belief, the fear can fade. Idealism provides a philosophical background for why changing ideas can change lived experience. Modern philosophers continue to discuss idealism in new ways. Some argue that modern physics supports a kind of idealism. Quantum theory shows that particles do not have definite properties until they are measured. In other words, the act of observation, an act of the mind, helps bring the particle's properties into being. This observation-dependent view echoes the idealist claim that mind plays a role in shaping reality. Other contemporary thinkers take a different route. They point out that even if the mind helps shape experience, there must still be something that the mind works on. They propose a neutral monism that says the basic stuff of the world is neither purely mental nor purely physical. This view tries to keep the insights of idealism while also respecting the feeling that the world is solid. The debate remains lively in philosophy departments today. To make the idea even clearer, imagine a simple analogy. Think of a painter and a canvas. The canvas by itself is just a blank surface. The painter adds colors, shapes, and stories. When the painting is finished, The viewer sees a scene that feels alive. The scene exists because of the painter's ideas. If the painter never painted, the scene would not exist. In idealism, the mind is like the painter, and the world is like the painting. The world comes into being through the mind's ideas. A second analogy uses a song. When a musician writes a melody, the notes exist only as sounds in the air and as ideas in the musician's mind. When someone listens, the mind turns the sound into a musical experience. The song feels real while it is being heard, but it disappears when the music stops. Yet the song lives on in the memory of listeners. This shows how ideas can create a reality that feels solid while they are present. Quotes from primary sources add weight to the discussion. Plato wrote, "The soul of man is immortal and unchanging, and it knows the forms." This line shows his belief that the true world is made of ideas. Berkeley famously said, "Esse, percipi," which means to be is to be perceived. This short phrase captures his idealist claim in a single sentence. The Upanishads state, "That which is the source of all things is the self." This line links all of reality to a single conscious source. Idealism also influences everyday thinking about art, culture, and meaning. When a person enjoys a poem, the poem's power comes from the ideas it carries. The words on the page are just ink, but the mind brings them to life. This experience shows that ideas can shape how the world is felt. In education, teachers often use idealist ideas to stress the role of imagination. They tell students that learning is not just about memorizing facts, but about forming concepts in the mind. By shaping ideas, students shape their own version of reality. This approach follows the idealist belief that the mind builds the world. Even law can be seen through an idealist lens. Laws are not physical objects. They are ideas that societies agree upon. When a law is written, it gains power because people accept it in their minds. The law's effect on behavior shows how ideas can create a reality that feels as solid as a rock. Critics continue to raise the objection that idealism cannot explain the existence of the universe before any mind existed. They ask, what about the time before humans, or even before any conscious beings? Idealists answer that the mind of a higher being, often called God, has always been present. In Berkeley's view, God's mind perceives all things at all times, so the world never lacks a perceiver. This response brings a theological element into the discussion. Another criticism points to scientific experiments that seem to show objects behaving independently of any observer. The classic double-slit experiment in physics shows that particles act like waves when not observed, but act like particles when observed. Some interpret this as evidence that observation matters. Others argue that the experiment does not prove that mind creates reality, only that measurement changes outcomes. Idealists use the experiment to argue that the act of observation, an act of the mind, has a role, while critics say the effect can be explained without invoking the mind. The debate over idealism is far from settled. It touches on questions about what it means to know, what it means to exist, and how humans relate to the world. By looking at ancient stories, modern science, and everyday experiences, the discussion stays alive. The core claim remains simple. Reality is tied to mind or ideas. Whether one agrees or not, the claim invites people to think about how thoughts shape the world they live in. In summary, idealism says that the world is not a collection of objects that exist apart from the mind. It traces its roots to Plato's forms and the Upanishadic notion of Brahman. Everyday examples like dreams and movies show how. Plato lived in a time when the world seemed full of change. He looked at the sky, at the hills, at the faces of friends, and he felt that something deeper must be behind all that change. He said that there is a realm of perfect ideas, a realm that does not change, that does not fade, that does not break. He called these perfect ideas forms. In his view, everything we see in the world is a copy of a form. The copy is imperfect. The form is perfect. To make the idea clear, Plato used a simple picture. He asked anyone to draw a circle. The hand will make a line that is close to a circle, but the line will always have bumps, a little wobble, a tiny gap. The drawn shape is a copy of a perfect circle. The perfect circle exists only in the mind, in the realm of forms. It never changes, never cracks, never fades. The drawn circles are many, they are all different, but they all try to copy the same perfect shape. In the same way, a table in a kitchen, a table in a market, a table in a palace, all are copies of the form of table. The form of table is perfect, unchanging, and exists beyond the world we see. Plato told a story about a child who loved apples. The child would sit under a tree and look at the red fruit. The child would close the eyes and picture the perfect apple, smooth, round, bright, sweet. In the child's mind, that perfect apple never bruises, never falls, never gets wormy. When the child picks a real apple, the apple may have a small spot, a tiny bruise, a bite taken out of it. The child sees the real apple and thinks of the perfect one inside. The child's idea of the perfect apple lives in the world of forms. The real apple is only a copy, a shadow of that perfect idea. The child's love for the perfect apple shows how the mind reaches for a reality that is not seen but felt. A musician once tried to describe a perfect note. He imagined a sound that never wavers, never drops, never rises. He imagined a tone that is pure, clear, and stays the same forever. When he plays his instrument, the note he makes has a tiny wobble, a breath of air, a slight change in pressure. The note he hears is a copy of the perfect note that lives in the mind. The perfect note is a form. The sound that comes out of the instrument is a copy, an echo of that form. The musician's experience shows how the world of forms works in music as well as in objects. Plato wrote many dialogues in which his teacher Socrates asks questions and tries to find the true meaning of things. In the Republic, Socrates says, "The objects we see are only copies of the true forms." He adds, "The visible world is but a shadow of the real world." These words point to the belief that the visible world is not the final truth. The truth lives in the realm of forms, where each form is perfect and eternal. Plato's ideas were not accepted by everyone. His student Aristotle grew up in the same school, the Academy, but he took a different path. Aristotle argued that the forms do not live in a separate realm. He said that the form of a thing is found inside the thing itself. He wrote, "The form of a thing is in the thing itself, not apart from it." For Aristotle, the shape of a chair, the color of a leaf, the sound of a note, all are part of the thing. There is no need to imagine a separate perfect idea that lives somewhere else. Aristotle believed that by studying the physical world, we can learn about its nature. He thought that the world we see is enough to give us knowledge. Aristotle gave another reason to doubt the separate world of forms. He said that if the perfect forms are separate, how can we ever know them? He asked. If the forms are beyond our senses, how can the mind reach them? He argued that the mind learns by seeing, touching, hearing, and then forming ideas from those experiences. He believed that the mind does not need a hidden realm to find truth. This view became a strong counterpoint to Plato's idealism. The academy, the school that Plato founded, was a place of lively discussion. It was built in a garden near the river Ilissus. Students would sit under the shade of trees, share meals, and talk about philosophy. One anecdote tells how a young student once asked Plato why a pot could not be perfect. Plato smiled and said that the pot is a copy of the form of potness. The student left the garden thinking about the invisible shape behind the clay. The story shows how the academy encouraged people to look beyond the surface. Another story from the academy involves a debate between Plato's followers and a visiting thinker from Persia. The visitor argued that the world is made of fire and water, that there is no need for a hidden realm of forms. Plato's students responded by pointing to the perfect circle drawn on the sand. They said that the sand circle is a copy of a perfect idea that cannot be made of fire or water. The debate ended with both sides respecting each other's view, but the memory of the sand circle stayed with the students as a reminder of Plato's claim. Plato's ideas traveled far beyond Athens. In Rome, the statesman Cicero read Plato's works and wrote about them. He said, "The forms are the true objects of knowledge, not the fleeting images we see." Cicero used Plato's ideas to argue that law and virtue should be based on unchanging principles, not on the changing opinions of the crowd. This shows how Plato's idealism influenced Roman thought on politics and ethics. Later, a Roman philosopher named Plotinus, who lived many centuries after Plato, built a new school called Neoplatonism. He took Plato's idea of the forms and placed them at the top of a hierarchy of reality. Plotinus wrote, "The one is beyond all forms, but the forms still guide the soul toward the good." His work shows that Plato's ideas kept growing, shaping new ways to think about reality, the soul, and the good life. The perfect circle analogy can be used in everyday life. Imagine a baker who wants to cut the perfect round cake. He uses a metal ring as a guide. The ring is a perfect circle, made of metal, never changing. The cake slice will always be a little off, a little uneven, because the dough moves. The baker sees the perfect ring and tries to copy it. The ring is like the form of a circle. The cake slice is a copy in the material world. Another example comes from a carpenter who builds a table. He measures the length, the width, the height, and tries to make the table stable and beautiful. He has a picture in his mind of the perfect table, a table that never wobbles, that always feels right. The picture is the form of table. The wood he uses may have knots, may warp with humidity. The finished table is a copy of the perfect idea. The carpenter's skill is the attempt to bring the form into the world. Plato also used the story of the allegory of the cave to explain his view. He imagined people chained inside a dark cave, facing a wall. Behind them a fire burns, and objects pass in front of the fire, casting shadows on the wall. The people see only the shadows and think the shadows are all that exists. One person breaks free, walks out of the cave, and sees the sun, the real objects, the true world. The freed person returns to tell the others, but they do not believe him. The shadows are like the copies we see in daily life. The real objects outside the cave are the forms. The sun is the source of truth and knowledge. This story helps the listener picture how the mind can move from the world of copies to the world of forms. Plato's view also touches on how we understand beauty. He said that beautiful things share a participation in the form of beauty, a painting, a song, a sunrise. Each is beautiful because it reflects the perfect idea of beauty. The painter does not create beauty itself. He copies it. The listener does not create the perfect note. He hears a copy of it. The idea of a perfect beauty lives beyond the world, and the things we enjoy are glimpses of it. Aristotle's counterpoint on beauty is that beauty can be judged by looking at the object itself. He said that a beautiful object has parts that are in harmony, proportion, and order. The harmony can be seen and measured. There is no need to appeal to a hidden, perfect beauty. This view makes beauty something we can study by looking at the world, not by reaching for an unseen realm. The debate between Plato and Aristotle continues to shape philosophy. When a modern scientist looks at an atom, he uses instruments to see its parts. He may think that the atom is the ultimate reality. A philosopher who follows Plato might say that the atom is still a copy of a perfect idea of atomness. The perfect idea does not change, even when the tools improve. The scientist's work becomes a way to get closer to the form, but never to fully capture it. In education, teachers often ask students to imagine a perfect triangle. The students draw many triangles, each with slightly different angles. The teacher then asks them to think of the perfect triangle that has 3 equal sides and 3 equal angles. The perfect triangle exists only in the mind. The drawings are attempts to copy it. This exercise shows how the idea of a perfect shape helps the mind understand geometry, even though no physical triangle can be absolutely perfect. In law, judges sometimes refer to justice as a perfect idea. They try to apply the law in a way that matches the ideal of justice. The law itself is a set of rules, but the ideal of justice is a form that guides how those rules should be used. This reflects Plato's belief that the world of forms can guide the world of actions. Plato's influence on later Roman thinkers is clear in the works of Seneca, who wrote about virtue as a timeless form. Seneca said, "Virtue does not change with the times. It is a fixed pattern." He borrowed the idea that the good life follows a perfect form of virtue, not the shifting opinions of the crowd. Even in modern art, the idea of a perfect form appears. An abstract painter may try to capture the essence of a tree with a few lines. The painter is not trying to paint every leaf, but to show the form of treeness. The viewer sees the painting and feels the idea of a tree, even though the picture is far from a realistic tree. This shows how the concept of forms can live in creative work. Plato's famous quote from the Republic captures his view. "The visible world is but a shadow of the real world." This line reminds the listener that what we see is not the whole story. The real story lives in the realm of forms. Aristotle's reply can be heard in his own words. The form of a thing is in the thing itself. He points to the concrete world as the source of knowledge. This contrast sets up a clear picture of 2 ways to think about reality. The Academy's garden became a place where students would discuss these ideas under the olive trees. One day, a young scholar asked, "If the forms are perfect, why do we need to study the copies?" The teacher answered, "By studying the copies we learn the shape of the perfect." The story shows how the Academy linked the study of the world to the search for the forms. A later Roman anecdote tells of a senator who read Plato's dialogues during a long journey. He kept a small wax tablet and wrote down the idea of the perfect circle each night. He said that the memory of the perfect circle helped him stay calm The garden of the mind is a place that exists only when the gardener imagines it. In that garden, the flowers, the trees, the paths are not made of soil and water. They are made of thoughts, of ideas, of the way the mind shapes what is seen. When the gardener stops to picture the garden appears. When the gardener lets the picture go, the garden fades. This simple picture helps to see how two great traditions in the East, Hindu Advaita and Buddhist Yogacara, treat the mind as the basis of all reality. Advaita, which means non-duality, says that the true self called Brahman is pure awareness. It is not a thing that sits inside a body. It is the light that makes all things shine. The famous line from the Upanishads, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, is often quoted. It means Brahman is real. The world is unreal. In plain words, the world we see is like a dream that appears because the mind is awake. The mind does not copy a world that already exists. It creates the world in the act of seeing. Shankara, the great 8th century teacher, wrote many commentaries on the Upanishads and on the Brahma Sutras. In his commentary on the Brahma Sutra 2:1-2, he says that the world is like a rope that looks like a snake in dim light. The rope is real. The snake is not. The snake appears only because the mind misreads the rope. Shankara's words are clear. The mind projects the world, but the underlying reality stays unchanged. He also writes, the self is never born, never dies, never changes. That line shows how Advaita places the mind, or pure awareness, above any changing form. Yogacara, a Buddhist school that grew in India and later moved to China, uses a similar picture but calls it mind only. The word Citamatra means that all dharmas, all things that appear, are just mind. The famous verse from the Yogacara text, the Mahanasagraha, says, all phenomena are like reflections in a mirror. They have no substance of their own. In plain speech, this means that everything we see is a reflection of the mind's activity, not a separate object. The story of the Buddha's disciple, Asanga, who is said to have received the Yogacara teachings in a vision, adds a vivid historical anecdote. The legend says that Asanga fell into a deep trance and saw a great luminous mind. When he awoke, he wrote down what he saw. This story shows how the mind itself is treated as the source of all experience in Yogacara. Both Advaita and Yogacara use everyday experiences to explain their ideas. Imagine planning a walk through a city. Before stepping out, the mind draws a map in the head. The route is visualized, the turns are imagined, the landmarks are placed. When the feet move, the mind's picture guides the steps. In the same way, the mind's picture of the world guides how the world appears. The route does not exist in the streets until the mind creates it in the mind's eye. Another everyday link is listening to a song. Before the first note plays, the mind hums the melody, feels the rhythm, expects the chorus. When the music starts, the mind's expectation meets the sound, and the experience feels complete. The song seems to be there because the mind has already built it. This is similar to how Advaita says the world is built by the mind's awareness, and how Yogacara says the world is only mind. Real-world applications of these ideas appear in modern psychology. Cognitive therapy often asks a person to notice how thoughts shape feelings and actions. When a person believes that a situation is dangerous, the feeling of fear follows. The therapist helps the person see that the fear is a mental picture, not a fixed object. This mirrors the garden metaphor. The garden of fear appears when the mind imagines it. In modern physics, some scientists talk about the role of the observer in shaping reality. The famous double-slit experiment shows that particles behave differently when they are observed. While physicists do not claim that the mind creates matter, the idea that observation matters echoes the idealist claim that mind is central. Modern interpreters of Advaita, such as the teacher Ramana Maharshi, often speak of self-inquiry. He would ask, "Who am I?" The answer, he says, is that the sense of a separate self is a thought. When the thought is seen, the true self, pure awareness, shines. This practice is a direct way to experience the garden that only appears when the mind lets go of its pictures. In Chinese Buddhism, the Yogacara school merged with Taoist ideas of emptiness. The Chinese master Xuanzang, who traveled to India to bring back texts, wrote commentaries that explain how the mind creates the world. He used the image of a screen on which a play is projected. The actors on the screen are not real. They are shadows of the mind's imagination. This image helps Chinese readers see the mind-only doctrine in familiar terms. Two major critiques come from materialist schools that deny that mind is the basis of reality. The Indian Charvaka school, which flourished around the 6th century BCE, argued that only what can be seen, touched, or measured exists. They said that the world is made of atoms that move and combine. For Charvaka, the garden of the mind is just a story. They would point to the fact that a tree falls even when no one is looking, and say that the tree's falling shows that reality does not depend on the mind. A second critique comes from the Chinese Mohist tradition, which emphasized concrete, practical results. Mohist thinker Mozi argued that ideas about mind creating the world are useless for solving real problems like building roads or feeding people. He would say that if the world were only a mental picture, then work on a field would be meaningless. The Mohist critique pushes back on idealism by demanding that ideas have tangible outcomes. Both critiques raise important questions. The Charvaka view asks how something that exists only in the mind can cause real effects. The Mohist view asks how idealist ideas can help in daily life. Advaita and Yogacara respond by pointing out that the mind's activity is not separate from the world. In Advaita, the world is a reflection of the same awareness that sees the world. In Yogacara, the mind's activity is the process that makes the world appear. So changing the mind changes the world. A historical anecdote about Shankara's debate with a materialist philosopher illustrates this response. The story says that a scholar from the Charvaka school challenged Shankara, asking how an unseen Brahman could cause rain. Shankara answered that the mind's awareness is like the sun that makes water evaporate. The sun is not seen as a thing, but its effect is clear. The rain is the effect of the mind's light. The story ends with the materialist conceding that the argument was hard to refute. Another anecdote comes from the rise of the Madhyamaka school, founded by Nagarjuna in the 2nd century CE. Madhyamaka is a Buddhist school that argues that all things are empty of inherent existence. It uses a method called the middle way to avoid the extremes of saying things exist absolutely or do not exist at all. Nagarjuna's famous line, "Things are empty of self-nature," is often quoted. This line shows a different angle on idealism. Rather than saying mind creates the world, it says that nothing has an independent self, including the mind. Yet the mind still plays a central role, because it is the place where emptiness is realized. Modern philosophers have taken these ancient ideas and placed them in new contexts. The American philosopher David Chalmers, who talks about the hard problem of consciousness, sometimes refers to Indian idealism as a way to think about why experience feels like something. He notes that Advaita's claim that awareness is fundamental matches the idea that consciousness might be a basic feature of reality. In Chinese philosophy, scholars such as Tu Weiming have linked Yogacarra's mind-only view with modern ideas about constructivism, the belief that knowledge is built by the mind. Examples from daily life help to see how these ideas work. One example is a child who imagines a dragon in the backyard. The garden looks empty, but the child's mind fills it with fire and scales. The dragon is not a physical animal, but the child reacts as if it were real. The child's fear, the running, the calling for help, all are real experiences caused by a mental picture. This mirrors the idealist claim that the mind can create a vivid world. Another example is a driver who plans a route before leaving home. The driver pictures the turns, the traffic lights, the speed limits. When the driver reaches the road, the mind's picture helps the driver navigate. If the driver had not imagined the route, the journey would feel more chaotic. This shows how the mind's model shapes the experience of the world. In education, teachers often ask students to visualize a concept before solving a problem. When a student pictures a fraction as a pizza cut into slices, the mind creates a concrete image that makes the abstract idea understandable. This practice follows the same principle that mind builds the world we experience. Modern technology also reflects idealist themes. Virtual reality creates entire worlds that exist only when the mind perceives them through a headset. The virtual garden appears only when the user's brain processes the images. When the headset is taken off, the garden disappears. This shows that a mind-dependent world is not a fantasy, but a real part of today's life. The garden metaphor can be extended further. Picture a gardener who wants to plant a rose bush. He first imagines the rose in his mind, its color, its scent, its shape. He then goes to the soil and plants a seed. The rose grows because the gardener's mind guided the action. In the same way, the mind's picture guides the body's actions, and the world unfolds accordingly. Critics from materialist schools often point to the fact that a garden can exist without a gardener's imagination. A wild meadow grows on its own. To answer this, Advaita says that the meadow is still a play of awareness, even if no human mind is looking at it. The awareness that underlies all things is like a silent gardener that is always present, even when no one is thinking about the garden. The Mohist critique would ask whether the garden metaphor helps a farmer grow crops. The response from Yogacarra is that understanding the mind's role can improve focus, reduce stress, and lead to better decisions in farming. When a farmer sees the field as a mind-created picture, he can work with the mental patterns that affect his labor, such as fear of pests or hope for rain. This mental work can improve real outcomes. Shankara's commentaries often use stories to illustrate his points. In one story, a king asks his sage whether a pot is real. The sage replies that the pot exists only while the mind holds the idea of a pot. When the mind stops thinking of the existence fades. This story shows how the mind's attention gives shape to objects. Nagarjuna's writings also contain vivid analogies. He compares reality to a dream. In a dream, a person can walk on water, fly, or speak with the dead. When the dream ends, those experiences disappear. He says that waking life is similar. The world appears because of the mind's activity. Yet, unlike a dream, the mind can become aware of its own nature, and that awareness is the path to liberation. The modern practice of mindfulness draws heavily on these ancient ideas. In mindfulness meditation, a person watches thoughts as they arise, like clouds moving across a sky. The clouds are not the sky. They are temporary shapes on the mind's surface. By noticing the clouds, the mind learns that thoughts are not solid things. This practice reflects the Yogacara. George Berkeley entered the scene in the early 18th century, a time when many philosophers were trying to explain how we can know anything about the world. He was born in Ireland, educated at Trinity College, Dublin, and later became a bishop in the Church of Ireland. The world of his day was dominated by the ideas of Isaac Newton, who described the universe as a great machine of matter moving in space. At the same time, philosophers such as John Locke had argued that the mind receives ideas from an external world of material things. Berkeley found both of those views unsatisfying. He wanted a picture of reality that would keep the mind central, that would avoid the puzzling notion of invisible matter that we can never see directly. He called his view immaterialism, and summed it up in a short Latin phrase, esse percipi, which means to be is to be perceived. In plain language, Berkeley claimed that objects exist only when they are seen, heard, touched, or thought about. If no mind is attending to them, they have no existence. The story of Berkeley's claim can be told with a simple picture. Imagine a forest full of trees. A traveler walks through the woods and stops under a large oak. He looks at the trunk, feels the bark, hears the wind rustle the leaves. In that moment, the tree is there for the traveler. Now picture a remote part of the same forest, a hidden glade where no one ever steps foot. The trees there stand in the same sunlight, sway in the same breeze, but no human or animal ever looks at them. According to Berkeley, those trees do not exist in the same way as the oak the traveler sees. They exist only as ideas in the mind of God, who constantly perceives everything. Berkeley's answer to the question of how the world can continue when no human eyes are on it is that God's mind never rests. God always sees every tree, every stone, every ripple on a pond. Thus the world never disappears. It lives on in the divine mind. Berkeley's argument rests on three main points. First, he says that we never have direct access to matter itself. All we ever experience are ideas, colors, sounds, textures, smells. When we look at a table, we see the color red, feel the smooth surface, hear the faint creak as we move it. Those are not the table itself. They are the sensations that the mind receives. Second, he argues that it is impossible to imagine a collection of ideas existing without a mind to hold them. If one tries to picture a bare object that is not being thought of, the mind immediately fills the gap with the idea of an observer. Third, he brings in God as the ultimate perceiver. Because God is an infinite mind, he can perceive everything at once, keeping the world alive even when mortal minds are absent. Berkeley presented his case in a series of works, the most famous being a treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge, published in 17. In that book he wrote, "If a thing were not perceived, it would be no thing." He also wrote a shorter, more playful dialogue called Three Dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, where the character Philonous argues for immaterialism, while Hylas defends the common-sense view of material objects. The dialogue format lets Berkeley show how ordinary conversation can lead to the surprising conclusion that the world is made of minds and ideas. The reaction to Berkeley's ideas was swift and intense. One of his most vocal opponents was Bishop Thomas Hobbes, who had long argued that matter exists independently of perception. Another was the Anglican bishop and philosopher Bishop George Butler, a leading defender of the materialist view. The debate with Butler became a famous episode in the history of philosophy. In one meeting, Butler challenged Berkeley by asking how a tree could keep its shape when no one looks at it. Berkeley replied that God's constant perception guarantees that the tree's shape is always maintained. Butler, still unconvinced, pressed on, suggesting that Berkeley's explanation turned the problem into a theological one rather than a philosophical solution. The discussion continued for weeks, with both men writing letters and pamphlets. The story of their debate is often told as a clash between a man of science who trusted the senses and a man of faith who trusted the mind. It illustrates how deeply the question of what exists can cut across both philosophy and religion. Berkeley's pamphlet, The Principles of Human Knowledge, was not just a dense philosophical treatise. It was also a bold public statement. He sent copies to many of his contemporaries, inviting them to read and respond. The pamphlet was printed in a small Dublin shop, bound in cheap paper, and distributed among scholars, clergy, and curious readers. Some accounts say that the pamphlet caused a stir in coffeehouses, where men would gather after work to discuss the latest ideas. A young student named John Wesley, who later founded Methodism, reportedly read Berkeley's work and was moved by its emphasis on the mind's role in shaping reality. This anecdote shows how Berkeley's ideas spread beyond academic circles and reached ordinary people who were trying to make sense of the world. Modern life offers many examples that echo Berkeley's claim that something exists only when it is perceived. One clear parallel can be found in social media. A post on a platform, such as Instagram or TikTok, may appear on a screen, but its life is measured by the number of likes, comments, and shares it receives. When the post stops being viewed, the platform's algorithm may push it down, eventually making it invisible to most users. In a sense, the post's existence in the public sphere fades when it is no longer perceived. Yet the post still exists as a file on a server, which raises a question. Is the digital file the real object, or is its meaning only alive when minds engage with it? Berkeley would say that the meaningful existence of the post depends on perception. The raw data alone is not enough. A second modern analogy lies in virtual reality. When a person puts on a VR headset, a three-dimensional world appears, full of objects that can be touched, heard, and moved. As long as the headset is on, the mind experiences those objects as real. When the headset is removed, the virtual scene disappears from awareness. The computer still stores the graphics, but the experience ends. This mirrors Berkeley's claim that objects need a perceiving mind to be present. In both cases, the technology creates a world of ideas that lives only while a mind is engaged. Berkeley's view does not go unchallenged. One major objection is called the problem of the unperceived world. Critics ask, if objects need to be perceived to exist, how can we explain the continued existence of distant stars, mountains, or the ocean when no human is looking at them? Berkeley's answer is that God perceives everything, but many find that answer unsatisfying because it mixes philosophy with theology. They argue that a purely philosophical theory should not rely on a divine mind to keep the world stable. Instead, they propose that matter exists independently, and that perception is simply a way of accessing that matter. A second objection is known as the argument from common sense. Everyday experience suggests that objects persist even when no one is watching. A cup left on a table does not vanish the moment a person walks away. People tend to trust that the world is stable and reliable. Critics say that Berkeley's theory contradicts this intuition and makes it hard to explain why we can plan for the future. If the future depends on the continuous perception of objects, then a sudden loss of perception would cause the world to collapse. Berkeley's reliance on God's constant perception is again seen as a workaround rather than a true solution. Some philosophers respond by saying that common sense is not a reliable guide for deep metaphysical questions, but the tension remains. Despite these objections, Berkeley's immaterialism still finds relevance today. In the field of cognitive science, researchers study how the brain constructs reality from sensory data. Experiments show that the mind fills in gaps, creates expectations, and sometimes perceives things that are not there. This supports the idea that what we call reality is heavily shaped by mental processes. Some scholars draw a line from Berkeley's insight to modern constructivist theories, which claim that knowledge is built by the mind rather than simply copied from an external world. Another modern interpretation comes from the philosophy of information. In this view, the universe can be seen as a network of data that becomes meaningful only when processed by an observer. The idea that information needs a receiver echoes Berkeley's claim that ideas need a mind. Even physicists who explore quantum mechanics sometimes talk about the role of the observer in collapsing a wave function. While the scientific language is different, the underlying intuition that observation plays a crucial role resonates with Berkeley's early insights. To illustrate how Berkeley's claim works in daily life, imagine a child playing with a ball. The child sees the ball, feels its surface, hears it bounce. In those moments, the ball is fully present. Later, the child puts the ball in a drawer and forgets about it. For a while, the ball is not being thought of. According to Berkeley, the ball still exists because God is looking at it. The child's later discovery of the ball in the drawer feels like a reunion with an old friend, not a surprise that the ball has suddenly come into being. This story helps show how the mind-only view can be woven into ordinary experience without breaking the flow of daily life. Another concrete example involves a museum exhibit. A painting hangs on a wall, admired by visitors. While a visitor looks at it, the colors and shapes are vivid in the mind. When the museum closes and the lights go out, no human eyes see the painting, yet the painting does not vanish. It remains stored in the museum's inventory, and its image lives on in catalogues. Berkeley would say that the painting's existence as an idea continues because God perceives it. The catalogues are another set of ideas that keep the painting in the network of thoughts. This example shows how the theory can accommodate the persistence of cultural objects. The story of Berkeley's debate with Bishop Butler provides a vivid glimpse into how philosophical arguments were conducted in the early 1700s. The two men met in a small study at Trinity College, surrounded by books and candlelight. Butler, a staunch defender of materialism, began by asking Berkeley to explain how a stone could keep its shape when no one was looking at it. Berkeley answered calmly, pointing to the heavens and saying that God's eye never blinks. Butler, not satisfied, pressed further, suggesting that if God were the only perceiver, then the world would be a divine dream. Berkeley replied that the world is not a dream, but a collection of ideas sustained by a mind that never rests. The debate lasted for hours, with both men citing scripture, logic, and the writings of earlier philosophers like Descartes. In the end, neither side won outright, but the encounter sparked a wave of pamphlets and responses that kept the discussion alive for years. A second anecdote about Berkeley's mind-only pamphlet concerns the way it was received by the public. After publishing his treatise, Berkeley sent a copy to the famous philosopher and mathematician Isaac Newton. Newton's reply, though brief, acknowledged the boldness of Berkeley's claim, but remained skeptical. The exchange was recorded in a letter that survived in the archives of the Royal Society. Meanwhile, a group of Irish clergy gathered in a parish hall to read the pamphlet aloud. They found the language simple enough that even a farmer could follow the argument. One of the listeners, a farmer named Seamus, later told his family that the idea, "the world is like a dream that God keeps watching," helped him feel more at peace with the hardships of daily life. This story shows how a dense philosophical theory can travel from academic halls to the fields and homes of ordinary people. Berkeley also used vivid analogies to make his point. He compared the world to a theatre where actors appear on stage only when the audience looks. When the audience turns away, the actors do not disappear. They simply wait for the next cue. In Berkeley's version, God is the audience that never turns away. Another analogy he offered was that of a painting. A picture on a wall is Kant's turn in philosophy is often called the transcendental turn. In this turn, the thinker says that the mind is not a blank screen that simply receives data. The mind has built-in ways of shaping what comes in. The mind orders sensations with concepts that are already there. In this view, the world we experience is a mix of what is out there and how the mind works. The idea is that the mind supplies the framework that makes experience possible. The thinker Immanuel Kant first set out this claim in his book, Critique of Pure Reason. The book appeared in 1781. It was a huge work. It took many years to write. The first edition was printed in Riga, a city on the Baltic Sea. The book caused a stir in the German capital. In Berlin, the philosophers and scholars gathered to hear about the new ideas. Some praised the work as a breakthrough. Others were angry and called it nonsense. The reaction in Berlin shows how bold the claim was. The claim was that the mind does more than just copy the world. Kant called his method transcendental. By that he meant looking at the conditions that make knowledge possible. He asked what must be true for us to have any experience at all. He answered that the mind must have certain structures. These structures are not learned from the world. They are built into the mind. Kant called these structures categories. The categories are like lenses that shape raw sense data. They turn a chaotic stream of sensations into a coherent picture. To see how this works, imagine a camera lens. Light from the world hits the lens. The lens filters the light. It bends the light so that an image forms on the film. Without the lens, the light would hit the film in a random way. The picture would be a blur. In the same way, the mind works like a lens. Sensations are like light. The mind's categories are like the lens. They filter the sensations. The result is an ordered experience. A simple everyday example helps. Think of reading a story that follows a familiar plot. The words on the page are just marks. The eyes send signals to the brain. The brain could treat the marks as random. But the mind already knows the idea of a story. It knows about characters, conflict, and resolution. Because of those built-in ideas, the reader sees a plot. The reader fills in gaps, expects a climax, and feels satisfaction at the ending. The story becomes meaningful because the mind brings its own concepts to the text. Another example is tasting food. The tongue sends signals about sweet, sour, salty, bitter, and umami. Those signals are raw data. But the mind also carries cultural expectations. In one culture, a spicy sauce is a sign of warmth and hospitality. In another culture, the same sauce may be seen as too hot. The mind's expectations shape the taste experience. The same chemical stimulus can feel pleasant or painful, depending on the concepts the mind already holds. The taste is not just the data. It is the data plus the mind's ideas. Kant gave a short definition of his view. He wrote, "Thoughts without content are empty, intuitions without concepts are blind." In plain words, a raw feeling without a concept does not become knowledge. And a concept without any feeling does not have any content. Both must work together. The mind supplies the concepts, the senses supply the content. The two join to make experience. Kant also said that space and time are not things that exist out there. He called them forms of intuition. That means they are ways the mind structures what it receives. When a person looks at a table, the mind automatically places the table in space and orders the moment in time. Without these forms, the raw data would be a jumble. The mind's built-in sense of space and time makes the world seem orderly. The thinker also listed 12 categories. They include unity, plurality, causality, and necessity. These are not learned by watching the world. They are already present in the mind. They are the rules that the mind uses to connect sensations. For example, when a ball rolls across the floor, the mind automatically sees a cause and an effect. The ball's motion is not just a series of pictures. The mind links the pictures with the category of causality. This link creates the idea that one event leads to another. Critics have argued that raw data can exist without the mind's help. One counter-argument says that animals with very simple brains still react to the world. A beetle can move toward light without any concept of light. The beetle's behavior suggests that raw data can cause action without a mind that orders it. The beetle's nervous system simply translates light into movement. No built-in categories are needed. A second counterargument comes from modern neuroscience. Some scientists claim that the brain processes sensory input in a step-by-step way. First, the eyes send signals, then the visual cortex builds a picture, then higher areas add meaning. The early steps happen before any concepts are applied. In this view, raw data does exist for a short time. It is only later that the mind adds concepts. The existence of a raw stage challenges Kant's claim that concepts are present from the start of perception. Kant responded to such worries by pointing out that even the earliest brain steps are shaped by the mind's structure. He argued that the brain cannot even start to build a picture without having some built-in ways to organize signals. The brain's wiring itself reflects the categories. In this sense, the mind structure is present at every stage, even before conscious thought. The impact of Kant's idea reaches far beyond philosophy. In education, teachers often use the concept of schemas. A schema is a mental framework that helps students understand new information. This idea mirrors Kant's categories. When a child learns about animals, the child already has a schema for living thing. The new facts fit into that schema. The child does not just store raw facts. facts, the mind shapes them. In law, judges use precedents. A precedent is a past decision that guides how a new case is judged. The judge's mind applies the concept of fairness and justice to the facts of the case. The raw facts of the case are not enough. The judge's built-in ideas shape the final ruling. This shows how Kant's view of the mind shaping experience appears in everyday decisions. Modern philosophers have taken Kant's turn in different directions. Some, like the German idealist Fichte, said that the mind does all the work. The world is just a projection of the mind. Others, like the British philosopher Sellars, tried to blend Kant's ideas with later science. They say that the mind's categories are like tools that evolve over time. The tools help us survive in a changing world. In contemporary cognitive science, researchers talk about predictive coding. The brain constantly makes predictions about what will happen next. The predictions are like concepts. The brain then compares the predictions with the incoming data. When the data matches, the brain confirms its model. When it does not, the brain updates the model. This process looks a lot like Kant's claim that the mind orders sensations with built-in concepts. The brain's predictions act as the categories that shape perception. A popular analogy for Kant's view uses a pair of glasses. The glasses have lenses that tint the world. If the lenses are blue, everything looks blue. If they are clear, the world looks as it is. The mind's categories are the lenses. They tint the raw data. The world we see is never the raw world alone. It is always the world through the mind's lenses. Another story from history helps illustrate the turn. In 1781, when the Critique first came out, a young student named Johann Gottlieb Fichte read it in a small shop in Berlin. He was so excited that he ran home to tell his friends. He said that Kant had finally answered the old question of how we can know anything at all. His friends, however, were skeptical. They thought Kant was just using fancy words. This anecdote shows how the new idea spread quickly, but also how it met resistance. A second historical note concerns the second edition of the Critique in 1787. Kant added a new preface. In it he wrote, "The pure concepts of the understanding are necessary conditions for the possibility of experience." He also responded to critics who said that his work made the world unknowable. Kant insisted that his system actually made knowledge possible, because it showed the exact role of the mind. The second edition softened some of the harsher language, but the core claim stayed the same. Quotes from Kant's own writing help to keep the ideas clear. In the Critique, Kant wrote, "All our knowledge begins with experience, but it does not arise out of experience." This short sentence captures the whole point. Experience gives the mind material, but the mind itself must shape that material. Another quote from the same work says, "Space is not a concept derived from outer experience, but a necessary representation which underlies all outer experience." The quote tells the listener that space is built into the mind, not taken from the world. The camera lens analogy can be expanded. Imagine a camera with a zoom lens. If the lens is set to a wide angle, the picture includes a lot of background. If it is set to a close-up, the picture shows only a small part. The mind's categories work like the zoom setting. They decide how much of the raw data to include in the picture of experience. The mind can focus on cause and effect, or it can focus on the whole scene. The picture changes with the setting. In the story of reading a familiar plot, the mind's lens helps the reader predict what will happen next. If the story follows a hero's journey, the reader expects a call to adventure, a trial, and a return. These expectations are not learned from the page. They are part of the mind's built-in story structure. When the story follows that pattern, the reader feels satisfaction. When it breaks the pattern, the reader feels surprise. The mind's lens is what creates the feeling. In the tasting example, cultural expectations act like a flavor filter. The same pepper can taste mild or hot. The mind's filter decides how the chemical signals are labeled. The filter can even change over time. A child may find a bitter taste unpleasant. As an adult, the same taste may be enjoyed in coffee. The change shows that the mind's concepts can evolve, but they are still needed to give meaning to the raw taste. The two counter-arguments show that the debate is still alive. The beetle argument says that simple organisms can react without concepts. The neuroscience argument says that the brain has a raw stage before concepts. Both point to places where raw data seems to act on its own. Kant's answer is that even the simplest nervous system has built-in ways to sort signals. The sorting is not a high-level concept, but a basic category like movement toward light. The mind, even at a low level, still supplies the order. Kant's turn also changed how later thinkers approached the problem of perception. The French philosopher Henri Bergson argued that time is lived, not just a form of intuition. He said that the mind can feel duration directly. This is a challenge to Kant's claim that time is only a mental form. Yet Bergson still agrees that the mind plays a role in shaping experience. He just gives a different picture of how that role works. In the 20th century, the American philosopher Wilfrid Sellars wrote about the myth of the given. He said that the idea of raw data given to the mind is a myth. This echoes Kant's claim that there is no pure data without the mind's concepts. Sellars used Kant's insight to argue that all knowledge is theory-laden. The mind always brings some sort of theory to the table. This shows how Kant's turn still influences modern philosophy. The practical side of Kant's view can be seen in design. A product designer must think about how users will perceive a new gadget. The designer knows that users come with built-in concepts of how buttons work. If the designer makes a button that looks like a knob, the user will treat it as a knob because of the mind's category of rotary control. The design succeeds when the mind's built-in ideas match the product shape. In marketing, advertisers use the same principle. They show a picture of a happy family eating a meal. The mind already has the concept of family togetherness. The picture triggers that concept, and the viewer feels a warm feeling. The raw image is just colors and shapes. The mind's concepts turn it into an emotional response. This is a modern example of how the mind shapes experience. Kant's claim also matters for science. Scientists collect data with instruments. The data are numbers and graphs. But the scientist's mind must apply concepts like mass, force, and energy to make sense of. German idealism did not stop with Kant. After the critique of pure reason, a small group of thinkers in Jena began to ask what the world looks like when the mind is not just a passive receiver, but an active creator. Johann Gottlieb Fichte, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, and Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel each tried to push the idea that reality is shaped by a collective spirit. They imagined a world where the whole is more than the sum of its parts, much like a choir where each voice joins to make a song. In a choir, No single singer decides the melody alone. The melody appears only when all voices blend. That image guided their thought about how human thought, culture, and history form a single, living whole. Fichte was the first to speak of the self-posits, or the I that creates itself. He wrote, "The I posits itself, and the not, I as its limit." In plain words, the ego is not a fixed stone. It builds itself by setting limits and by reaching out to the world. For Fichte, the world is a stage that the self creates through its own activity. The self is not alone. It meets another self, and the two shape each other. The result is a community of minds that together make reality. This idea fits the choir analogy. Each singer's voice is an I, but the song exists only when the singers listen to each other and adjust. Schelling took the choir idea a step further. He argued that nature itself is a living expression of the same spirit that makes human thought. In his system of transcendental idealism, he wrote, "All that is the unfolding of the same absolute." He tried to show that the rocks, the rivers, and the clouds are not dead matter, but parts of a larger mind process. In everyday terms, imagine a sports team that follows a shared strategy. Each player knows the plan, but the play only works when they move together. If one player decides to act alone, the team loses its shape. Schelling saw the natural world as a team that follows a deep, shared plan, even when individual parts seem separate. Hegel brought the choir picture to its fullest. He described history as a world spirit that moves forward like a conversation. He wrote, "The truth is the whole." For Hegel, each event, each idea, each person is a note in a long, unfolding song. The song grows richer as more notes are added. The final chord is not a single note, but the harmony of all notes together. Hegel's dialectic, often called thesis-antithesis, can be seen as the way a choir resolves tension. One voice sings a line, another voice answers, and together they find a new harmony. In this view, reality is not a fixed picture, but a living process that needs many voices. These thinkers all shared a belief that the mind, the world, and history are linked. They argued that the individual cannot be fully understood apart from the community. The choir analogy helps to see why. A single voice can sing a tune, but the richness of a choir comes from the interaction of many voices. The same holds for ideas. A single thought can be clear, but a culture's ideas become deep when they talk to each other over time. Real-world applications of this view appear in many places. In a classroom group project, each student brings a skill. One may be good at research, another at writing, another at design. The final product is better than any single effort. The group's shared intention shapes the outcome, just as the choir shared melody shapes each singer's part. In modern business, companies often talk about corporate culture. That culture is a set of shared beliefs that guide decisions. When the culture is strong, the company can act as one organism, much like the spirit that Hegel described. Modern philosophers still use the language of spirit and community. Some call it social constructivism, the idea that many of the things taken for granted, money, gender, even scientific facts, are built by shared agreements. The German idealists would see this as a continuation of their claim that reality is not just out there, but also in the mind of the community. In neuroscience, researchers study how groups of neurons fire together to create a conscious experience. That research echoes the choir picture. Many small parts work together to make something larger. Critics have raised two main objections. First, they point out that individuals often have very different experiences of the same event. A student may feel that a group project was chaotic, while another feels it was smooth. If reality is a shared spirit, how can such opposite views both be true? Second, critics argue that the focus on the collective can hide personal oppression. When a choir sings a song written by a single composer, the singers may have to follow a line that does not reflect their own feelings. In the same way, a society spirit might force people to accept norms that hurt them. These objections remind that the balance between the individual and the group is delicate. Historical anecdotes bring these ideas to life. In 1799, a young Fichte arrived in Jena and began meeting with a circle of eager students and professors. They called themselves the Jena Circle. They would meet in coffee houses, discuss Kant's ideas, and then push beyond them. One night, after a heated debate about the nature of the self, a storm knocked out the lights. The group lit candles and continued talking. That candlelit night is remembered as the moment when Fichte's idea of the self-posits took shape. The Jena Circle showed how a group of minds could create new philosophy together, just as a choir creates a new song. Schelling's own story also shows the power of community. He was invited to give a lecture in Berlin in 18. The hall was full of students, professors, and curious citizens. As he spoke about nature as a living spirit, a sudden fire alarm sounded. The crowd rushed out, but many stayed to listen as the lecture continued in a nearby hall. The incident became a legend. Even a fire could not stop the spread of his ideas. The audience's shared attention turned a chaotic moment into a memorable event, much like a choir staying in tune despite a sudden gust of wind. Hegel's lectures in Berlin provide another vivid picture. In 1818, Hegel began a series of public lectures that attracted large crowds. People came from all over the city, some with tickets, some standing in the aisles. One evening, a soldier in the audience shouted a question about freedom. Hegel paused, smiled, and answered by linking the soldier's concern to the larger movement of history. The crowd erupted in applause. Hegel's ability to connect a single question to the grand story of the world spirit made his lectures feel like a living choir, where each voice could be heard and then woven into the whole. Quotes from the original thinkers help keep the ideas clear. Fichte wrote, "The I is the absolute condition of all reality. In simple terms, the self is the base on which everything else rests." Schelling said, "Nature is the visible spirit, spirit the invisible nature." He meant that what we see in the world is a form of the same mind that thinks. Hegel declared, "The owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of dusk." This poetic line means that philosophy can understand a system only after it has lived through history. Much like a choir can hear the full harmony only after the song ends. To bring the choir analogy back to everyday life, consider a sports team's shared strategy. The coach draws up a play that relies on each player knowing where the others will be. If one player decides to ignore the plan, the whole play breaks down. The success of the play depends on the collective mind of the team. In a classroom group project, each member must agree on a common goal. The final report reflects the group's shared understanding, not any single student's idea. Both examples show how a collective mind can shape a result that no single mind could achieve alone. The modern world still uses these ideas. Social media platforms act like a giant choir. Each post is a voice, but the overall tone of a community emerges from the interaction of many posts. When a hashtag spreads, It shows how a shared intention can shape public discourse. This mirrors the German idealist claim that reality is co-created by many minds. However, the two criticisms remain relevant. In social media, some users feel alienated when the dominant tone does not match their experience. The collective voice can drown out individual nuance. Likewise, in a sports team, a player who feels the strategy does not fit his style may become disengaged, showing the tension between the group's plan and personal comfort. The German idealists offered a hopeful picture that by listening to each other, humanity can create a richer reality. Their choir metaphor suggests that harmony is possible when each voice respects the others. Yet the history of the Jenner Circle and Hegel's lectures also reminds that harmony does not happen by accident. It requires effort, dialogue, and sometimes even chaos, like a storm that forces a group to find a new space to talk. In the end, the legacy of Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel lives on in any place where people gather to shape a common story. Whether in a choir, a sports team, a classroom, or a nation, the idea that reality is a product of a collective mind continues to inspire. Their work invites each listener to hear the other voices, to add one's own note, and to help create the song of human life. The story of idealism in the 20th century begins with a shift in how philosophers think about mind and world. In the early 1900s, Edmund Husserl launched a new method called phenomenology. He wrote that every act of consciousness is directed towards something, that it always has an object. He put the quote, "All consciousness is intentional" on the page to remind readers that mind always reaches out. By focusing on how things appear to us, Husserl gave a way to study experience without first assuming a material world. This move set the stage for later thinkers who would say that mind comes first. A few years later, Alfred North Whitehead introduced process philosophy. He argued that reality is made of events, not static things. In his own words, the many become one, and the one becomes many. For Whitehead, each event carries both physical and mental aspects. This view opened a path for philosophers who want to see consciousness as a basic part of the world, not a side effect. In the middle of the century, a new metaphor helped to spread the idea that mind could be the ground of reality. Imagine a computer program that writes its own code as it runs. The program does not follow a fixed set of rules written by an outside hand. Instead, it creates the rules that shape its own world. In the same way, idealist thinkers claim that consciousness writes the rules that shape the world we live in. The world is not a hard shell that the mind fills. The world is a pattern that the mind draws. One modern illustration of this idea can be seen in video games that build virtual worlds. In a game like Minecraft, the player moves blocks, creates structures, and even changes the laws of physics inside the game. The game does not have a fixed landscape before the player arrives. The landscape grows as the player thinks and acts. The player's mind decides what the world looks like, what it can do, and what it means. The game world exists only because the player's consciousness gives it shape. This example shows how a digital environment can act like a small version of an idealist world. A second illustration comes from the way language shapes perception. When a child learns the word tree, the child does not only learn a label. The child learns a whole way of seeing the world that includes height, shade, and the idea of growth. The word becomes a lens that changes how the child experiences the forest. Philosophers such as Ludwig Wittgenstein have said that the limits of language are the limits of our world. If language is a tool that builds the world in the mind, then the world is built by mind. This shows how everyday speech can act like the code of a program that defines its own reality. Contemporary idealists take these ideas further. David Chalmers, a philosopher of mind, talks about the hard problem of consciousness. He asks why any physical process should feel like something at all. He suggests that perhaps consciousness is a fundamental part of the universe, like space or time. He writes, "Conscious experience is not something that can be reduced to brain activity." By calling consciousness a basic building block, Chalmers puts mind at the start of the story of reality. Another modern voice is John Searle, who defends what he calls biological naturalism. He says that consciousness is a real feature of the brain, but it cannot be explained by breaking the brain into smaller parts. He uses the example of a university lecture. The lecture is a real event, but it is not the same as the chalk on the board. In the same way, consciousness is real, but it is not just a sum of atoms. Searle's view supports the idea that mind has a special status that cannot be ignored. These thinkers often point to the way modern science builds models of the world. In physics, the equations that describe particles are themselves a kind of language. The equations do not exist outside the mind that writes them. When a physicist writes an equation, the equation becomes a tool that shapes how the scientist sees the universe. This mirrors the idealist claim that the world is shaped by the mind that thinks it. Physicalist scientists raise objections to this view. One objection comes from a neuroscientist who argues that every mental event can be traced to a brain event. He says, when a person sees red, neurons fire in a specific pattern. The pattern explains the experience. For him, the brain is the source of all mind, and there is no need to give consciousness a fundamental role. He points to brain scans that show activity matching thoughts and feelings. This data, he claims, shows that mind is just a product of matter. A second objection comes from a physicist who works on quantum field theory. He says that the universe can be fully described by particles and fields that follow precise laws. He writes, the mathematics of quantum theory does not need any notion of mind to work. For him, the success of physics shows that mind is not needed to explain the world. He worries that idealism adds an unnecessary layer that makes science harder. Idealist philosophers respond to these objections by pointing out that the data does not settle the question of why there is experience at all. The neuroscientist can map brain activity, but the map does not tell why the map feels like something. The physicist can predict particle behavior, but the equations do not explain why the equations appear to a mind. Both critics assume that a purely physical description is enough, while idealists ask what the description is for. A historical anecdote helps to see why this debate matters. In 1910, Husserl gave a lecture in which he asked his students to set aside all beliefs about the external world and look only at what appears. This move, called epoché, was meant to clear the mind of assumptions. The students reported that even simple colors seemed to change when they tried to view them without preconceptions. This story shows how early phenomenologists saw the mind as the starting point for any knowledge. Another anecdote comes from the early days of process philosophy. Whitehead attended a meeting of mathematicians who were trying to formalize space and time. He argued that their formulas missed the lived experience of change. He wrote a poem about a river that never stays the same, and he used that image to explain his idea that reality is a flow of events. His poetic image helped many philosophers see that the world is not a static block, but a living process. Modern idealists also use the metaphor of a computer program in more technical ways. In artificial intelligence, a reinforcement learning agent receives rewards and updates its policy. The policy is a set of rules that the agent writes for itself based on experience. The world that the agent interacts with is shaped by the policy it creates. If the policy says, "Avoid red squares," then red squares become dangerous. The agent's mind, in this case a set of algorithms, defines the world it lives in. This mirrors the claim that consciousness defines the world. A third modern example can be found in social media algorithms. The feed that each user sees is built from the user's own clicks, likes, and shares. The algorithm learns what the user likes and then shows more of that. The user's mind guides the algorithm, and the algorithm in turn shapes the user's perception of reality. The user ends up living in a bubble that is a product of their own mental patterns. This shows how mind can generate a world that feels real. Idealist philosophers also look at how language creates categories that shape thought. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis suggests that speakers of different languages see the world differently. For example, some languages have many words for snow, while others have just one. Speakers of the first language notice subtle differences in snow that speakers of the second language may miss. This supports the idea that the mind, through language, builds the world it experiences. In contemporary debates, some philosophers argue for a panpsychist view. This view says that even the smallest particles have a tiny form of experience. The claim is that consciousness is not something that appears only in brains, but is a basic feature of all matter. Philosopher Galen Strawson writes, "If experience is a fundamental feature, then the universe is full of mind." This line of thought pushes idealism toward a view where mind is everywhere, not just in humans. Another modern strand is neutral monism. This view, taken up by philosophers like Thomas Nagel, says that the basic stuff of reality is neither mental nor physical, but something neutral that can appear as either. Nagel writes, "There is a single kind of stuff that can be described in mental terms or in physical terms." This approach tries to bridge the gap between idealism and physicalism, but it still gives mind a central role. The conversation also reaches into ethics. If consciousness is fundamental, then the way we treat other beings changes. An idealist might argue that all beings share a common mental ground, so harming any conscious creature harms a part of the same world. This view can lead to stronger arguments for animal rights and environmental care. It also influences how we think about artificial intelligence. If a future AI can have a form of experience, an idealist would say that the AI deserves moral consideration because consciousness is a basic part of reality. In the field of education, the idea that mind shapes world can be used to design better learning environments. Teachers who focus on students' mental frames can help students build new worlds of understanding. When a student learns a new concept, the student's mind creates a new structure that changes how the student sees other subjects. This process matches the idealist claim that each act of understanding builds a new world. Critics from the physicalist side point out that many idealist claims rely on vague language. They say that saying, "mind creates world," is not a testable hypothesis. A physicist may ask, how can we measure the mind's role in shaping the laws of physics? The physicalist answer is that experiments can only measure particles and fields, not abstract mental structures. This objection pushes idealists to find ways to link their ideas to empirical work. Idealists respond by turning to the philosophy of science. They note that scientific theories are themselves mental constructs that guide experiments. The choice of what to study, the way data is interpreted, and the language used to describe results are all shaped by human minds. In this sense, the practice of science shows that mind does shape the world of inquiry. The idealist sees this as evidence that mind is not a later addition, but the starting point of any scientific story. A further historical point helps to see the growth of these ideas. In the 1920s, the Vienna Circle promoted logical positivism, which tried to ban metaphysics from science. They argued that statements about mind were meaningless unless they could be verified. This movement pushed many philosophers to focus on language and verification. However, the later rise of phenomenology and process philosophy showed a reaction against that trend, bringing mind back into the core of philosophy. In the 1940s and 1950s, the development of quantum mechanics opened new doors for idealist thinking. The observer effect, where measurement seems to affect the outcome, suggested that the act of observation has a role in the behavior of particles. Some idealists took this as a hint that consciousness might be linked to the physical world in a deep way. While many physicists warned against over-interpreting the mathematics, the episode gave idealists fresh material for their arguments. Today, the discussion continues in conferences and journals. Papers on consciousness first appear alongside studies of brain imaging. Some philosophers propose that the universe has a built-in intrinsic nature that is mental. Others argue that the brain is a kind of computer that runs a program written by evolution. Both sides use the computer metaphor, but they differ on whether the program is mind or matter. The metaphor of a computer program that defines its own world can be expanded. Think of a simple script that runs a simulation of a city. The script decides where roads go, where houses stand, and how people move. The city exists only because the script tells it what to be. If the script changes, the city changes. In the same way, an idealist says that the script of consciousness writes the script of reality. The story of idealism begins in ancient Greece, where Plato imagined a world of perfect forms that stood behind the everyday objects people see. He wrote that the visible world is only a shadow of a higher reality that can be reached by thought. In the same vein, early Indian philosophers of the Vedanta tradition taught that the ultimate reality is a single conscious ground called Brahman, and that the world of change is a play of that consciousness. Both traditions set the stage for a view that the mind is not just a tool that records facts, but a source that shapes what is real. Centuries later, the Irish thinker George Berkeley sharpened the idea into a clear claim. To be is to be perceived, he said, using the Latin phrase esse percipi. He argued that objects exist only when a mind sees them, and that the ultimate mind is God, who constantly perceives everything. Berkeley wrote, "The world is a great book of signs, and the eye is the interpreter." By denying the existence of matter apart from perception, he forced philosophers to ask what it means for anything to be real. Immanuel Kant took the discussion in a new direction. He said that the mind does not just receive sensations. It also organizes them with built-in structures such as space, time, and causality. Kant called this transcendental idealism, meaning that the world as we experience it is shaped by the mind's own rules. He wrote, "The objects of sense are but appearances, not the things in themselves." For Kant, there is a reality that exists beyond our senses, but we can never know it directly because our thoughts always color what we see. Later, German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel pushed the idea further. He saw reality as a living process of ideas that unfold over history. Hegel described this as the absolute spirit moving toward freedom. He claimed that the world's shape is the result of collective thought, culture, and language. Hegel's view linked the growth of societies to the evolution of ideas, suggesting that history itself is an expression of mind. These thinkers share a core argument. Reality is not a fixed block of stone that sits outside of us. Instead, it is a pattern that our minds constantly create and revise. When a person looks at a tree, the brain does not simply copy a picture. It interprets color, shape, and movement, turning raw data into the concept of tissue. In that sense, the tree is partly a mental construction. The same process works for emotions, values, and social rules. If thoughts can shape what appears real, then changing thoughts can change life. One everyday example of this power is the placebo effect in medicine. When a patient believes a harmless pill will help, the body often produces real relief. The belief itself triggers chemical changes that ease pain or lower blood pressure. This shows that the mind can bring about physical changes simply by holding a certain expectation. It is a modern illustration of the idealist claim that ideas can create material results. Another common case is the self-fulfilling prophecy in education. A student who expects to do well studies with confidence, asks questions, and persists through setbacks. Those actions lead to higher grades, confirming the original belief. Conversely, a student who expects failure may avoid effort, and the poor results reinforce the initial doubt. The belief, not the raw ability, becomes the decisive factor. This pattern matches the idealist view that expectations shape outcomes. To make the point vivid, imagine a high school junior named Maya. Maya has always thought she is bad at math. When a new teacher asks the class to solve a problem, Maya hesitates, avoids raising her hand, and watches the lesson pass by. Her low confidence keeps her from practicing, and her test scores stay low. One day, a counselor shares a story about a famous mathematician who struggled early on, but kept trying. Maya begins to see herself as capable of growth. She starts to answer questions, asks for help, and spends extra time on homework. By the end of the term, her grades rise dramatically. The shift in Maya's belief about herself created a real change in her performance, showing how an inner narrative can rewrite the outer result. A second scenario unfolds in a small coastal town that has faced repeated storms. For generations, the townspeople told a story that the sea was a living guardian that protected them if they honored it with festivals. When a severe storm threatened the harbor, the community gathered, sang the old songs, and lit lanterns along the shore. The shared belief gave the people courage, and they worked together to reinforce the levees and rescue boats. The storm passed with less damage than expected. The story did not stop the wind, but it mobilized the townspeople, creating coordinated action that reduced loss. The episode shows how a collective narrative can shape the way a society responds to real danger. Idealism does not go unchallenged. One strong counterview comes from materialist philosophers who argue that the world exists independently of thoughts. They point to the laws of physics, which work the same whether anyone is looking at them or not. A materialist might say that a rock will fall because of gravity, not because anyone believes it should. In this view, ideas are products of brain chemistry, which in turn is shaped by the material environment. The materialist claim is that changing thoughts can affect behavior, but the underlying cause is always the physical world. A second counterargument is offered by Marxist theory, which emphasizes material conditions as the engine of history. Marx wrote that the mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. From this angle, beliefs, culture, and ideas are reflections of the economic base. The story of the coastal town, for example, would be seen as a response to the material need to protect property, not as a proof that the story itself created safety. Marxists would argue that the real driver is the town's need to survive in a harsh environment, and that ideas simply arise from that need. Even with these challenges, idealist ideas keep finding fresh expression in modern life. One recent movement is mindfulness, which teaches people to observe thoughts and feelings without judgment. Research shows that regular mindfulness practice can lower stress hormones, improve focus, and even change brain structure. The practice works because participants learn to see thoughts as mental events that can be watched and let go, rather than as fixed truths that control them. In this way, mindfulness embodies the idealist insight that changing the inner narrative reshapes the outer experience. Another contemporary debate circles around artificial intelligence and consciousness. Some philosophers argue that a sufficiently advanced AI could develop a mind of its own, suggesting that consciousness can emerge from complex information processing. Others counter that without a subjective inner life, AI remains a sophisticated tool, not a true thinker. The discussion hinges on whether mental states are purely physical patterns or require something beyond matter. The AI debate revives the classic idealist question: is mind the foundation of reality, or does reality simply give rise to mind? To illustrate the power of ideas, consider an analogy of a painting. The canvas itself is a flat piece of cloth, but the painting becomes a landscape, a portrait, or an abstract scene only because the artist's mind decides what colors and shapes to place. The viewer's mind then adds meaning, turning pigment into emotion. If the artist had imagined a different scene, the canvas would have held a different world. Likewise, the world we live in is like a canvas that our thoughts continually paint upon. A second analogy compares reality to a dream. While dreaming, the mind creates people, places, and events that feel real in the moment. When the dream ends, the images fade, but the experience was vivid while it lasted. In waking life, thoughts can act like the dream maker, constructing a sense of self and a view of the world that feels solid, even though it is built from mental activity. The dream analogy helps to see how powerful the mind can be in shaping what is taken for granted as real. History offers more stories that show the link between ideas and change. In 309 BCE, Socrates stood before a jury in Athens and was sentenced to death for corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods. His defense rested on the claim that questioning accepted beliefs leads to a better life. Though he died, his ideas survived through his student Plato and later shaped Western thought. Socrates' trial illustrates how a single set of ideas can challenge a whole society's norms and leave a lasting imprint. Another anecdote comes from the 18th century when Bishop George Berkeley faced a storm of criticism after publishing his idealist treatise. He wrote letters defending his view, saying that the world's stability comes from God's constant perception. Critics accused him of denying the existence of matter, but Berkeley replied that the fear of nothingness was itself a mental construct. His spirited defense sparked lively debates across Europe, and kept the conversation about mind and matter alive for generations. Modern scholars continue to reinterpret idealism. Some combine it with neuroscience, suggesting that the brain's predictive coding system constantly generates expectations that shape perception. In this view, the brain is an active storyteller, filling gaps in sensory data with guesses. When the guesses are right, the world appears stable. When they are wrong, surprise occurs. This scientific angle echoes the classic idealist claim that the mind plays a central role in forming reality. In the field of health psychology, the belief-health link has become a major research area. Studies show that patients who hold optimistic expectations recover faster from surgery, while those who expect pain report higher intensity. The mechanism involves stress hormones, immune response, and attention. By teaching patients to adopt positive mental frames, doctors can improve outcomes without changing the physical treatment. The practice rests on the idea that inner narratives can alter bodily processes. In education, teachers now use growth mindset language, encouraging students to see ability as developable rather than fixed. When a teacher tells a class, "You can get better with effort," the students often work harder and achieve higher scores. The shift in belief creates a real change in performance, echoing the earlier story of Maya. The growth mindset approach shows how a simple change in language can reshape a whole learning environment. The mindfulness movement provides a concrete modern example. In 2015, a public school district introduced a daily 10-minute mindfulness session for all students. Within a year, teachers reported lower classroom disruptions, and test scores in reading rose by 5%. Researchers traced the improvement to reduced anxiety and increased attention, both products of changed mental habits. The district's success story demonstrates how a practice rooted in observing thoughts can produce measurable, material benefits. The AI consciousness debate also offers a vivid illustration of idealist themes. In 2023, a leading tech company announced an AI model that could generate poetry that many users found moving. Some philosophers argued that the model's ability to mimic human language showed a form of mind emerging from data patterns. Others countered that the model lacks first-person experience, that it merely rearranges symbols without any feeling. The clash highlights the question of whether a system that processes information can ever possess an inner life, or whether consciousness requires something beyond physical computation. Returning to the community story, the Coastal Towns Festival can be seen as a ritual that aligns shared belief with collective action. When the townspeople sing the ancient song, they reinforce the idea that the sea watches over them. That belief creates trust, reduces panic, and allows coordinated work on the levees. The result is not